There are voices that aren't just heard, they're felt. They slip into the listener's heart like a midnight whisper, sending shivers down your spine while stirring an aching longing. And in the history of American country music, no one embodied that more clearly than Conway Twitty. From a poor boy on the banks of the Mississippi, enchanted by the guitar his grandmother taught him to play, to a towering superstar who once ruled both the rock and roll and country worlds, Conway Twitty wasn't just a performer. He was a living symbol of love, loss, and a will that refused to surrender to fate. His life was a long ballad, filled with soaring highs and tear-stained lows. He stood at the peak of fame, yet also fell into heartbreak from broken families, financial setbacks, and losses no success could mend. But through it all, he never stopped singing. In this piece, we'll retrace the journey of the man behind that unusual name, from little Harold Jenkins to the legendary Conway Twitty. A life composed of notes that never faded, even long after the curtain fell. Early life, childhood amid hardship and warm melodies. When Harold Lloyd Jenkins, later known as Conway Twitty, was born on September 1st, 1933, in the small town of Friars Point, Mississippi, America was in the grip of the worst economic crisis in its history. It was the era of the Great Depression, when every meal was a struggle, and the future hung like a heavy fog over the rooftops of the poor southern towns. His family lived modestly. His father, Floyd Jenkins, was a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi River, a drifting livelihood that carried both sweat and hope. His mother, Velma, was a gentle, hard-working woman who did her best to bring warmth into their tiny home despite the constant lack. They had no wealth, no prestige, but they had one thing in abundance: love and music. On winter nights, when they didn't have enough firewood, Velma would hang old blankets over the windows to keep out the cold, and the family would huddle together and sing to forget the freezing air. Those weren't just songs. They were lullabies for the soul, sweet memories that first connected young Harold to the depths of human emotion. It was in that poverty that he learned music didn't need to be grand. It just needed to be honest. From an early age, Harold was enchanted by his grandmother's guitar playing. She was the one who taught him his first chords. And when his father played old records by Hank Williams, Ernest Tubb, or blues artists singing in dusty southern bars, Harold would hide behind the door, silently transfixed. Music, for him, didn't come from books. It came from the earth, from blood, from the sighs of the South. Like many other boys in rural poverty, Harold grew up among cotton fields, cicada songs, and crackling AM radio stations. But in his mind, there was always a different kind of sound, a blend of blues sorrow, country soul, and the wild edge of rock that hadn't even been named yet. By age 10, Harold had formed his first band, the Phillips County Ramblers, performing at local events. He didn't know music theory, but he understood how to read an audience's heart, a gift no classroom could ever teach. That childhood, though filled with material hardship, became the spiritual treasure that shaped the man Conway Twitty would become. It was those early years as a poor Southern boy that forged his humility, his closeness to people, and his voice. Soft, intimate, almost like a whisper in your ear, that would later captivate millions with songs about love, loneliness, and unfulfilled dreams. There was always something aching in his music, like a mother's lullaby in the night, dust from the scorched roads of Arkansas, and dreams once folded beneath pillows to escape hunger. Perhaps that's why, when Conway Twitty sang, people didn't just listen. They remembered. They understood. and sometimes they cried. Early career. When the Korean War broke out, Harold Lloyd Jenkins, the Southern boy who once adored blues music and baseball, was drafted into the military. Even during his years of service far from home, he never parted with music for a single day. On distant military bases in the Far East, surrounded by loneliness and cigarette smoke, he formed a small band called the Simons, performing for fellow soldiers to help soothe their homesickness. It was there, in the nights pierced by the sound of distant gunfire, that he began to understand music was not just an art, it was salvation. After returning from service in 1956, Harold Lloyd Jenkins, the Mississippi native who had survived war with only a guitar and a dream, entered the world of music with a clear goal: to become a professional singer. But Nashville didn't welcome him. No record label cared about a man with no name, no fame, and nothing to offer but faith. To survive, he had to take any job he could: loading freight, delivering gas, waiting tables, pumping fuel. By day, he worked with his hands. By night, he struggled in cheap studios, knocking on the doors of local radio stations, carrying demo tapes in the frayed pocket of his shirt, and the look of a man who had nothing left but hope. Those were years of hunger. Hunger for money, hunger for opportunity, but never a hunger for passion. The first album he attempted, filled with the popular rockabilly sound of the time, was repeatedly rejected. Major labels dismissed him as lacking personality, unoriginal, just another Elvis clone. One executive bluntly said, "You'll never be famous." But Harold didn't quit. At his lowest point, he met Jack Nance, a drummer and budding songwriter. They bonded over their love for rock and roll and together wrote a song called "It's Only Make Believe." Jack wasn't a famous producer, but he saw something in Harold Jenkins, a voice that couldn't be trained, only born. Around this time, Harold decided to change everything: his name, his image, even his singing style. One day, while looking at a map, his eyes stopped on two towns: Conway, Arkansas, and Twitty, Texas. No one helped him choose. It was his decision to create a new identity: Conway Twitty. A name that sounded like destiny, Southern, memorable, mysterious. Under this new name, he signed a deal with MGM Records and released his first single, "I Need Your Lovin'," in 1957. But the song quickly faded into silence, failing to chart or gain traction. It was his first major failure, and he realized that a new name couldn't mask the fact that his talent still needed honing. Instead of giving up, Twitty and Jack Nance kept writing. On a rainy night in Memphis, they finished "It's Only Make Believe," a heartfelt ballad filled with doubt and a desperate longing to be loved, mirroring Conway's emotional state at the time. Initially, the label released the song quietly, with little promotion. But then, something remarkable happened. The song began to spread from town to town. Radio stations started spinning it late at night. And by the end of 1958, "It's Only Make Believe" soared to #1. Won on the Billboard Hot 100 and went on to top the charts in 21 countries. Overnight, Conway Twitty transformed from an unknown into an international star. But he never forgot that behind the new name was a past smudged with grease, calloused hands, tearful rejections, and the belief of people like Jack Nance, the first to say, "You deserve to be heard." Career success. When the words, "Hello, Darlin'," rang out in the spring of 1970, no instrument needed to play, no spotlight needed to shine. An entire concert hall fell silent. Because with just one line, low, husky, and full of feeling, Conway Twitty made millions of hearts melt. It was no longer just a greeting. It was the scratch of memory, the breath of an unfinished love. And from that moment on, a legend quietly ascended to the throne of country ballads, not with grand declarations, but with truth turned into song. Leaving behind the noisy world of rock and roll, where he had once touched the peak with "It's Only Make-Believe," Conway stepped into country music like a man returning home after a long journey. He didn't try to be modern. On the contrary, he slowed down, choosing instead to tell old stories of love, of longing, of sleepless nights spent beside someone whose heart was already elsewhere. At a time when country music was being modernized, Conway remained faithful to his warm baritone, slow rhythms, and understated storytelling. And that's precisely what made him stand out. No one sang about physical longing, human betrayal, or the aching regrets of love quite like him. In "I'd Love to Lay You Down," it was the soft whisper between longtime lovers. In "You've Never Been This Far Before," the trembling gaze of a woman crossing boundaries once forbidden. And "Linda on My Mind" revealed the crack between two lives, a present wife and another woman who had claimed his heart. His songs didn't hide behind metaphors. They weren't polished or pretty, but they were real, and that truth hurt. Yet listeners couldn't turn away. Behind the lights, Twitty was never one to show off. He stepped on stage in a plain suit, his hair neatly styled, eyes meeting the crowd as if to say, "I'm not singing for everyone. I'm singing for one person." That intimacy, paired with a voice smooth as silk and charged with quiet power, made his music reach beyond ears, to the heart. And then, in the midst of his career's brightest period, Conway met Loretta Lynn, a strong, outspoken woman with a heart full of unhealed scars. At first, they only intended to record a few duets for fun. But when their voices blended, something magical happened. Unlike typical singing pairs lost in cliches, Loretta and Conway sounded like two people reliving a real conversation. In "After the Fire Is Gone," they sang of a love extinguished but still smoldering. "Lead Me On" became a plea layered with pride. And in "Louisiana Woman, Mississippi Man," they ran wild into a world where love knew no borders. Audiences believed they were a real-life couple, because what they shared couldn't be rehearsed. Natural chemistry, matching gazes, and silent understanding. They never loved each other romantically, but between them was a deep connection that went far beyond friendship. Loretta once said, "If I had a brother in music, it would be Conway." And indeed, beyond his radiant solo career, those duets with Loretta became the golden piece that completed Conway Twitty. His success wasn't measured by statistics, though he had 40 #1 hits on the country charts, more than any artist of his time. It wasn't about Grammy trophies or CMA and ACM awards piling up in a room. It was because his music was unforgettable. Because whenever someone misses a former lover, sits alone in the dark, and turns on the radio, chances are they'll hear his voice. Rough, deep, tender, like sorrow that hasn't found its name. Conway Twitty didn't need to become a symbol. He only needed to sing from his heart, and naturally that made him the voice of all the hearts quietly breaking. Controversy and tragedy. Under the stage lights, Conway Twitty embodied calm and allure, a man who sang love songs as if he had loved, lost, and suffered 1,000 times. But behind that polished figure was a soul repeatedly fractured by the very things he sang about: love, responsibility, and an unfillable loneliness. He was married 4 times, and though each marriage began with hope, nearly all ended in sorrow. His first wife, Ellen Matthews, married him when they were both very young, but the relentless touring, financial struggles, and a hazy future quickly wore down their fledgling relationship. They divorced after just 1 year, a marriage that drifted away like dust in the wind during his early career. His second marriage to Temple Mickey Medley lasted longer, 14 years, and brought them 3 children. But it coincided with Conway's transition into country music, a period when he was constantly touring, recording, and caught in the rising wave of fame. During those years, he was nearly absent from home. The growing silence between them became a chasm too wide to bridge. They separated in 1970, just as Hello, Darlin was sweeping across America. The third marriage, to Temple Mickey Medley, was brief. Some said that while Conway always tried to love fully, his heart never stayed in one place for long, except on stage. It wasn't until his fourth and final marriage, again to Dolores Henry, that he found a measure of peace. But even with a woman who loved and understood him, Conway remained troubled. In several interviews toward the end of his life, he admitted, "I spent my whole life trying to please the audience, and sometimes I forgot that my family needed me just as much." As a father, he loved his children deeply. He took them on tour, taught them music, and always made space for them in his heart, even if he couldn't always be present in their lives. But he understood. Sometimes love isn't enough without presence, and that realization haunted him until the end. Yet personal wounds weren't all he had to endure. In the late 1970s, now a country superstar, Conway pursued a grand dream, building Twitty City, a massive entertainment complex combining his private home, a museum, studios, and a concert venue in Hendersonville, Tennessee. He envisioned a space where art and fans could meet, a second Graceland. But dreams couldn't shield against reality. High operating costs, unstable revenue, and several failed investments pushed Twitty City into financial crisis. When Conway passed in 1993, he left behind not only a musical legacy, but also a significant debt, forcing his family to sell the entire complex the following year. Throughout the 1980s, he also faced a long legal battle with a former manager over royalties and contracts signed before he rose to fame. The lawsuit drained time and resources and left him in prolonged emotional stress. For an artist who preferred peace and privacy, being dragged into courtrooms was a burden hard to bear. Still, he never allowed himself to stop. Conway kept touring, recording, and stepping on stage with his familiar smile, all while fighting quiet battles no one could see. Then, on the night of June 4th, 1993, after performing in Branson, Missouri, he suddenly collapsed on his tour bus. It was an abdominal aortic aneurysm, a silent, deadly condition. Despite emergency surgery, he passed away early the next morning at age 59. There was no formal farewell, no parting words for fans, just another performance, then eternal silence. The country music world was stunned. No one expected him to go so soon. His voice was still powerful. He was planning a new album and had sung the night before. A few months before his death, Conway had confided to a friend, "When I die, I just hope people can still hear my voice in the dark. No need to cry, just remember." And what he hoped for came true. Personal life. Conway Twitty never truly retired. Even into his 50s, with over 3 decades under the stage lights, he chose to remain on the path he had always known, singing, recording, touring. To him, music was not a career. It was breath itself. Many urged him to slow down, take care of his health, spend more time with family and rest. But he would just offer a quiet smile. "I'm afraid if I ever stop singing, I'll stop living too." In his final years, he no longer toured as intensively as during his peak, but he maintained a steady schedule, especially in small towns where he had first started. It wasn't for the money. It was to return to the audiences who had been with him from the beginning, the ones waving from the back rows, needing no fireworks, just a single "Hello, Darlin" to feel their youth return. He never spoke much about his health, but everyone could see that he had lost weight, moved more slowly, and no longer wore the same wide grin as before. In his last years, he reportedly suffered from dizziness, insomnia, and severe abdominal pain, but he kept it to himself. Just like how he sang about sorrow, not flaunting it, only letting it quietly seep through every lyric. By then, his family life had settled. Beside him was his 4th wife, Dolores D. Henry, the woman who never needed the spotlight but always stood by him backstage. His children had grown up. Some pursued music, others chose their own paths, but he maintained close ties with all of them. He called each of his kids an unfinished song, and once joked that if he ever made a final album, he'd name it "For My Kids Who Survived a Singer." In his final interviews, he often appeared with a faraway look, not sad, not radiant, just the expression of a man who had traveled far and was quietly looking back. When asked what made him most proud in life, he didn't mention awards or #1 hits. He simply said, "I never lied to myself. I sang exactly what I felt." And though he had endured financial crises, divorces, lawsuits, and countless personal losses, he maintained a gentle demeanor, often with an unexpectedly dry sense of humor. Once, when an audience member asked how many of his love songs were based on real experiences, he laughed and said, "If I told the truth, my last wife probably wouldn't let me come home." He left this life the same way he lived it, quietly, without warning, leaving behind a voice that still echoed in the ears of those who listened. But in every audience member, every small town he once passed through, every woman who wept softly after one of his songs, Conway Twitty never truly left. Legacy and influence. When looking back at the history of 20th century country music, it's easy to get swept up by the louder names, those with explosive personalities, scandal-filled lives, or the ones who set trends. But amid all the noise, there was always one voice that remained steady, like the southern soil itself: Conway Twitty. He didn't need fanfare or to reinvent the times. He chose to reach people's hearts in the simplest and most profound way. Conway's influence on country music wasn't about revolutionizing sound or style. He did something harder. He set an emotional standard for the country ballad. Before him, ballads were often sorrowful laments, but few dared to portray love with such raw realism. Love between grown-ups, full of contradictions, physical and emotional longing, betrayal, inner conflict, and the kind of pain that wasn't pretty, but was true. He made country music not just the voice of rural America, but the language of anyone who had ever loved. Many later artists, from George Strait and Vince Gill to Tim McGraw and Garth Brooks, have acknowledged that Conway taught them how to put their hearts into a song, how to tell a story like a confession, and how not to let technique overshadow sincerity. Thanks to him, the country ballad became a core pillar of modern country music, paving the way for generations of artists to speak about unspeakable emotions with grace instead of avoidance. Conway's contributions extended beyond the stage. In line with his quiet nature, he never turned his causes into slogans. He was one of the earliest country stars to support Farm Aid, a grassroots movement to help struggling American farmers, often performing for free to raise funds for family farms on the brink of collapse. Growing up in a Southern working-class family, he understood the meaning of land, of rice fields, of dinner tables where tomorrow's meal wasn't guaranteed. His support wasn't driven by trends, it came from empathy. He also participated in children's education initiatives, wrote children's books, and even publicly supported equality in love, at a time when the country music world was still cautious around the LGBTQ+ community. He wasn't an activist, but he didn't stay silent. To Conway, it didn't matter who you loved. It only mattered how you loved. And he expressed that through his music, not through slogans. Because of all this, Conway Twitty slowly became an American cultural icon. Uniquely so. He wasn't controversial, wasn't sensational, and never starred in some flashy biopic, but everyone knew who he was. He didn't represent the South with Texas bravado, nor was he part of the outlaw rebel movement. Conway Twitty was the face of the quiet ones, the hard workers, the deep lovers, the ones who always took a step back so others could step forward. You won't find his face on a trendy hipster t-shirt, but you will hear his voice on an old radio crackling to life in a small Kentucky town. You won't see him at glamorous awards shows, but you will hear his name in family stories when a father tells his son, "Your mom and I used to dance to Conway Twitty in the kitchen." Conway Twitty never tried to become a symbol, but by staying true to himself, by singing honestly even when it hurt, he became an inseparable part of America's cultural memory. And that's why, even as times change, his voice remains, like an echo from a place where feelings have never gone out of style. Conway Twitty was never someone who chased the spotlight. He was the one who stayed after the lights had gone out, the voice of broken hearts, of unfinished love stories, of quiet afternoons where someone sits alone, turns on the radio, and longs for nothing more than a voice that understands. For over 4 decades, he didn't need gimmicks to stand out. No scandals, no political rants, no chasing trends. All he needed was a guitar, a story, and a voice that whispered just enough to make someone choke up by the first line. When he passed away, no grand bells rang, but millions quietly pressed play to hear an old song again. Mothers told their daughters, "Back then, this is how a man sang about love." Lonely men sat silently in their cars, not crying, but not yet ready to drive away. And in that moment, Conway Twitty was still alive. He never asked to be called a legend. But if music is memory, he is the keeper of its softest, most tender part in the American heart. If you've ever loved, ever lost, ever failed to say that one last word, then maybe, just maybe, Conway Twitty already sang it for you. Don't forget to click like and subscribe if you want to continue this journey with us, exploring the timeless voices that shape the soul of America. We'll see you in the next story.